Dr. Dan Garay is Vice President and Senior National Security Analyst at the Lexington Institute, a nonprofit public policy research organization headquartered in Arlington. Dan, and many of you may be familiar with him, is also a national security analyst for NBC, and I'm sure many of you have seen him at various times on NBC. In addition, Dan has held several senior positions in both private sector and the U.S. government, including serving at various times as a member of the 2001 DoD transition team, director of the OSD Office of Strategic Competitiveness, and a senior analyst with CNA, SAIC, and other organizations. In addition, Dr. Garay is a respected teacher and prolific author. He has taught or lectured at the Johns Hopkins University, the Foreign Service Institutes, various war colleges, the Inter-American Defense College, Georgetown University, and the National Defense University. He has been published in more than 24 journals and periodicals. Dr. Garay holds an MA and PhD degrees from Johns Hopkins University and a BA from Pomona College. Please join with me in welcoming Dr. Dan Garay.
All right, we are wireless, wow, okay. Well, I really want to thank Mike, APL, and the Rethinking Strategy Project for the opportunity to speak on the subject of US, Russian, and Chinese nuclear strategies, their interaction and prospects for reductions. My first question, though, is you've been doing this for 6 years, and this is the first time you invited me? Darn, all right. Did you? I'm sorry, I forgot. All right, that's okay. All right, then you're forgiven. You know, Mike's invitation allowed me to return to my roots in Cold War nuclear studies, particularly from what was then the Soviet side. But now, because of the nature of the subject, I got to talk or read more and become acquainted with the issue of Chinese posture and strategy. And of course allowed me to acquaint myself with the current literature on nuclear strategies, policies, and programs, Russian, American, and to some extent Chinese. And I got to say, after spending some time delving into the literature, from my vantage point of being away from it for 10 or 15 years, that it hasn't gotten any better. Fortunately, in comparison to the Cold War, there's just a lot less of it. Now, that situation is likely to change, right? I expect that the quantity of these writings will dramatically increase in the years to come. I certainly hope the quality will improve or stay high, or at least the readability of a lot of these writings. We have the New START Treaty and the prospect for a follow-on agreement, which, to borrow a phrase, put arms control back on the agenda. More significantly, for the nuclear and arms control wonks among us, there's the administration's advocacy of complete global denuclearization, the so-called zero option, which in some respects gives us a kind of a new chew toy to kind of gnaw on and to think about something different than what's ever been there before. It also seems to me that the last 10 years or so, all three countries that I'm going to talk about really were able to, and of necessity almost had to, pursue their nuclear strategy and force developments rather independently of each other. And we could get into a good debate around here whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. There are views on both sides. But clearly that independent ability, the sort of going off without much consideration for what others thought, or at least not reacting to it much, that's over with if we are going to be moving forward with even more reductions, or at least the attempt to reduce and to rationalize. So I want to focus on three topics, mostly based upon the guidance I got for this presentation. The first is the political and military roles of nuclear forces and the security strategies of each of the three countries. And frankly, this is an easier task than I thought when I first started it, in part because we actually have some very good recent literature, official, right? Most obviously, to those in the room, is the QDR, the 2010 QDR, and the associated reports, NPR, BMDR. Russia has published not long ago a national security strategy, national defense strategy, depends on the translator you get. And even China, which not generally known for being prolix when it comes to the subject of its own nuclear thinking, came forward with the 2008 Defense White Paper, which does talk about security issues, its nuclear program, and connects it to other issues of strategy and force requirements. Right, so that's the first topic. Second topic is the relationship between nuclear forces and other military capabilities, and it's good we're going to be dealing with that because I think the two end up being intimately related, certainly in the way the various subject countries are going to be looking at this question. You have Russia's conventional military force, which remains in a state of relative decrepitude. You have China engaged in a major military modernization program, both broad and deep. You have the United States, which is undergoing a process that the Secretary of Defense terms rebalancing. You have issues of defense budgets and their implications, new NATO strategies and all the rest. So how that all works together and what it means for nuclear forces, nuclear strategies, is I think a really important topic. You also have the emergence of new kinds of threats, whether it's so-called hybrid opponents, advanced anti-access area denial capabilities, and one which doesn't get mentioned often in this context, and the stuff I read, which is cyber warfare, which may be an entirely new area. How does it fit in? How do you think about it? Do any of these countries think about it in the context of overall strategy and forces is I think, a good question. For the U.S., of course, the rebalancing involves the deployment of missile defenses and also, at least conceptually, conventional prompt global strike, which will impact on the nuclear question. Third topic is the future of nuclear arms control, and most particularly the prospects of moving what has been largely a bilateral process, with all due respect to France and Great Britain, into a at least tripart process and possibly rapidly into a multilateral process. It may be possible to continue down the road of reductions bilaterally from maybe one more cycle. And there's been some suggestion of dropping the numbers to about 1,000 for the US and Russia, and then everybody gets to sort of jump in the pool, as it were. But I believe we're fast approaching the point that if we're going to go down, maybe even going down to 1,000, is going to require a different framework, at least a consideration of other players, and possibly their actual inclusion at some level. So let me start by talking about each of the players, their strategies, and go from there. So the first issue, right? Talk about the US, right? Well, for the US, of course, we no longer have to rely on the efforts by the Wisconsin Project on Arms Control, FAS, CDI, you name it, to figure out the size of the US arsenal. We've come clean, 5,000 and change warheads as of September 30th, I guess, of last year, 2,200 of them on strategic delivery vehicles, about 800 and change, several hundred more non-strategic weapons, and the remainder of the force is essentially reserve or inactive and awaiting dismantlement. Clearly a sharp reduction from the Cold War levels. Under New START, these numbers are going to continue to decline, although relatively modestly. To about 1,550 warheads, maximum of 700 deployed vehicles. In addition, as announced by the administration, the U.S. will be reducing its inventory of non-strategic nuclear weapons by retiring the Sea-Launched Cruise missiles. We get a bit of a reduction. This agreement really allows the U.S. in some ways to avoid the difficult choices that some were hoping the United States would make. For example, the move to a dyad, elimination of land-based forces, or bombers. Bombers are sort of in there under different rules. In the next round, a new base camp, to use a term of art, that's not going to be possible. So we're not only going to have to talk about numbers, but from the US side, and obviously certainly from the Russian side, we're going to have to start thinking about, can you maintain a triad? To what extent can you even have a viable dyad? What should that look like, and why? And I would suggest that some of the reasons we've argued historically for maintaining certain classes of forces and certain deployments pretty much ought to go away if we can convince ourselves that the logic of nuclear strategy, nuclear deterrence, or non-deterrence, strategic stability, whatever constellation of terms we want to talk about, kind of warrants going down to low numbers. In essence, what I'm saying is that, in effect, if you can talk yourself going down to low numbers, you may be over the hump with respect to questions of first strike stability, crisis stability, all those kind of things, assuming you have some balance of weapons, some sensible approach. And therefore, the kind of reasons we had all these complex arrangements and interesting mixes of forces may not be necessary as a logical question. Now, whether it will still be necessary because of the realities of the world, another question. Despite a lot of concerns going in, when the administration came to office with a lot of the rhetoric, when we saw some of the people who were actually in positions of authority or to influence strategy, there was a lot of concern about, how far would the administration go on nuclear weapons policy, arms control, and the like. Let me suggest, at least from my perspective, the administration has been remarkably cautious and careful. Right? The approach to nuclear weapons and strategy, in some sense, is laudable. That is, where we are now on that with the NPR and the like, is particularly laudable in light of the continuities in this administration's approach to national security with its predecessors. Now, I'm not sure I want to call this a glass half full or half empty argument. You can tout whatever pieces of the security strategy and administration policy you want, but overall, change, yes. Radical change, no. And a lot of acknowledgement, explicit and implicit nods to, in fact, traditional interest, values, approaches, and strategies. So the United States is still committed to the security of its allies in Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, as well as defense of the global commons. We're going to remain in its role in the role of global leader. We're going to have to maintain military superiority, which kind of follows from the previous points, et cetera, et cetera. We'll exercise leadership differently. There'll be different mixes of components. We'll try some new things. But again, the kind of basics of the strategy, our interests and ours, not changed. And I think it's in light of that the NPR is also a fairly impressive document, even though it preceded the national security strategy. Kind of like a Karnak moment, it just knew what was coming. In fact, I would argue to you that many of the administration's most ardent critics on the matter of national security have really found it hard not to at least damn the NPR with faint praise, but some praise it definitely it needs. Yeah, the NPR has narrowed the conditions under which nuclear weapons would be used, but with enough caveats and conditions to provide plenty of maneuver room. I'm not only thinking about this with respect to Iran, North Korea, but even the comments on China, which is, I think, illustrative of that caution. Deterrence, both central and extended, maintained. The NPR really accepts the classic concept of nuclear strategy. For deterrence to work, the threat of retaliation must be credible. The consequences unacceptable, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue to you that while the NPR doesn't really explicitly so state, but the way it approaches the issues of force sizing, posture, motivations, if you will, leaves open the possibility still for limited nuclear options and a process of managed escalation. So we have not even come off of that at all. Right? So that's fairly, if you will, traditional, conservative, balanced, cautious, depending what word you like to use. The NPR's willingness to narrow the scope for nuclear use certainly reflects a view, and it's explicit, and I think we can all acknowledge that the threat to U.S. security at the moment, and that to America's friends and allies from hostile WMD use or even large-scale conventional aggression is relatively low. Now, certainly as a generalized statement. There are certain places you can say it maybe change it, but still relatively low. I mean, this is a very optimistic point. I think the documents have a certain optimistic tone to them, but frankly, so did the nuclear strategy, in their own way, the nuclear strategy and security strategy documents of the preceding administration. So I mean, it generally was based upon a positive view. It was just a matter of whether the administration decided to strut or not. Or was it walk, I guess, was the way George Bush put it. It wasn't strutting. But I think it also reflects or raises the question, reflects a belief that one of the advantages the U.S. possesses and will continue to develop is the capability to inflict, in many instances, unacceptable damage through conventional means. And that's sort of an added kind of a point of interest and even optimism. And I bring that up because I'll talk about it later in terms of what that means if that's the direction we're going with respect to reaction of the other two players and the question of nuclear balance, but also raise the question of, and if we lose that capability, or if the question is raised about our ability to inflict unacceptable damage, assuming we agree on what that means, what does that mean for then, just on the US side, going to zero? All right? It seems to me, I think, quite clear that QDR, NPR clearly accept the idea that nuclear weapons have political utility talk about reassurance and all the rest. Whatever you may think about the military utility, and I think that still holds, and that's terribly important, I think, because frankly it's always been more really the issue. It has not changed. On the question of whether nuclear reductions promote stability or the other way around, you have to have the stability in order to get the reductions. I think the NPR kind of straddles the line, ultimately though coming down on the idea that strategic stability with Russia and China is needed as a precondition for going to zero, which in a sense suggests that global peace is a condition for global denuclearization. I'm extending this a little bit, but I think that's sort of almost where you have to come out from their own statements. Interestingly enough, the BMDR, Ballistic Missile Defense Review, adds a really kind of another layer to this by acknowledging and really accepting that missile defenses, strategic defenses, or theater defenses, mixed, have a central role to play in U.S. security strategy, particularly as it relates to how we reassure allies, how we deal with theater-level threats. So what we have here on the U.S. side is a measured step, if you will, in the direction of less, not a leap into the abyss, but this step, these documents really leave the big strategic questions unanswered. Simple things like, can you have deterrence at low numbers? What does minimum deterrence mean for the U.S.? What does it mean in a three-party or multi-party context as compared to the bilateral context? What about conventional forces and defenses in that context? Can you really get to zero? What does zero even look like? All that sort of is left now to be done, now to be discussed, now to be written about. So that's where the literature comes out. All right, moving to Russia. I mean, we kind of know what the numbers look like. The Russians had a few more weapons than we did on deployed on vehicles, about the same number, a little more vehicles themselves, a fair amount of reserve weapons. Where there was a gross difference, and how gross is still a matter of debate, was on non-strategic nuclear weapons. And depending on who you listen to, the disparity between US and Russian non-strategic weapons could be anywhere from 5 to 10 to 1. Becomes an issue in the next round of negotiations on reductions, and it may be a deal breaker, I will argue. The force on the nuclear side is rapidly aging. We know the Russian forces were coming down. In fact, some of the critics of the START agreement have said, it actually allows them to have more, by a small number really, than they would have had if we had just sort of let nature take its course and allowed these systems to age out. The agreement also reflects in some sense the trouble that Russia's having with modernization of the force, something that may come into play in the future as a problem for the Russians certainly, and maybe even for us as we try and achieve a stable relationship, strategic relationship, whatever the level we go at. Right? I mean, the bomber fleet is as old as it can get, sort of may even exceed the age of the US force. Subs are a problem. The Bore, Belova not moving along well. What they've got is essentially, silo-based and some mobile ICBMs, and that's about it. So, and not even the big boys anymore. We're down to about 30 of those. So it's a rapidly aging force, and don't have a lot of options for getting really clever about it, at least not that I've seen. So the U.S. interest in arms control reductions, I would argue, is a reflection of a sense of confidence that we hold about the international scene, about our security situation, and an altered perception of the threat. For Russia, however, the interest in arms control is a reflection of a sense of weakness, of being embattled. Therefore, it doesn't suggest that their approach to nuclear weapons is that they're less relevant to their security, rather quite the contrary. Russia's leadership is clearly aware of their own vulnerability, and in some cases it causes them perversely to behave more aggressively on the international stage. In addition, they're well capable of reading the tea leaves. The secular demographic, social, economic trends argues that this sort of movement in terms of weakening of Russia, and hence its vulnerability, as they perceive it, is only likely to grow. So in some respects, Moscow here's the clock ticking. It has a limited amount of time in which it can take advantage of the few resources it has, perhaps Western goodwill, the interest in achieving a new stability, to try and leverage itself into a secure position as a co-equal, that's the goal they have, of the world's great and rising powers. Not simply the United States, it also has to concern itself with China. Now, interestingly, if you look at the Russian writings, take the national security strategy, right? It identifies both internal and external threats. I mean, it's a real interesting, kind of Rorschach test of the Russian angst, right? The major external threats really are U.S. and NATO. Kremlin clearly identifies NATO viability and its potential enlargement. Actually, the enlargement that's already happened has been bad enough, but potential future enlargement as a threat to its national security, right? Strategy makes clear that Russia finds unacceptable the encroachment of the alliance infrastructure to its borders, been done, as well as NATO's attempts to, and quote, assume global responsibilities which are inconsistent with international law. And it talks about the unsustainability of the existing global and security architectures that are oriented towards NATO. Now, this is particularly interesting since, what was it, this week or late last week, Secretary of State Albright published the results of a study, of a commission, really, that she had chaired, their study on NATO 2020, which did what? Envisions a revitalized and military stronger NATO engaged in more out-of-area operations. So the future of NATO goes directly, if you will, into the heart of the Russian insecurity. Not for that reason. In fact, I'm not even sure that they really thought about this as an issue for Russia, but in order to maintain the viability of the alliance, in order to share the burden of security globally and all the rest. Russians are in what one Russian professor called Medvedev's dilemma, right, vis-a-vis the West. On the one hand, Russia would prefer not to return to a policy of confrontation. On the other hand, the Kremlin cannot just stand by and watch the US and NATO pursue a policy that they think of as establishing military superiority. Although, in many respects, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot that Moscow can do about it, certainly without our acquiescence, and maybe not even them. The late director of national intelligence said, and I quote, "Russia continues to use its military in an effort to assert its great power status and to project power abroad, including through the use of heavy bomber aviation patrols, out-of-area naval deployments, joint exercises. Some of these activities can have great demonstrative impact rather than real military significance." This is political in nature, certainly for domestic purposes, but actually from the Russian leadership's point of view, it's externally driven. The threat analysis or picture has a domestic component. The response here is really driven to an external audience, I would argue. So, we're now back, not in great numbers, but to scenes we hadn't seen in 15, 20 years. Russian subs patrolling off the US coast, bear bombers penetrating NATO airspace, Russian warships repeating the old Soviet-era Caribbean cruise, this time to Venezuela instead of Havana, but, deja vu all over again. So, coming back to some of the issues of nuclear policy as it relates to this view, that threat assessment, those concerns, and the sense of domestic weakness really raise a dilemma for Russia internationally. How can it agree to the elimination of its nuclear weapons when they alone are the essential bulwark against what it perceives to be, Moscow perceives to be, real threats? Not imminent, but real threats. Additionally, what would be the basis for Russia's claim for a high place and unique status in the world were it not to retain one of the world's largest arsenals of nuclear weapons? What's the alternative here? It is not conventional forces, clearly, and it's not really, in the end, economics, so what's left? The truth here is that Russia desperately needs nuclear weapons. It is a power on the international stage almost solely because it possesses those weapons. Yes, it can beat up on Georgia. Okay. Next. collapse of Russia's economy following the end of the Cold War, parlous state of conventional forces, sense of proliferating threats, results, I would argue, in the mind of the Kremlin's leaders, in a logical case for an increased reliance on nuclear weapons. Unlike, if you will, this administration, which is sort of arguing that the possession of the weapon constitutes, in some respects globally, more threat than security, Russia's view is exactly, I would say, the opposite of that, right? So nuclear weapons are perhaps the one capability that guarantees Russia's ability to deter aggression. In fact, one could even argue nuclear weapons may be the only thing that really allows Russia to have any relevance in the evolving international system. Yeah, it's a big country with an economy, right? There was one Western political scientist with extensive experience in Moscow who made an interesting connection between the retention of nuclear weapons and Russian political and psychological needs. Let me quote here. As the self-perceived isolated great power in a highly competitive global environment, Russia regards nuclear weapons as the mainstay of both its security posture and its status among the major powers of the 21st century. Even though the likelihood of war with an ex-Cold War adversary, America, its European allies, and China is extremely low, right? Nuclear deterrence gives a measure of comfort to the Kremlin that Russia's vital interests will be respected under all circumstances, TBD, but all right, by Washington and Beijing, whose military powers and combined national might, relatively, are now far greater than Russia. So that's essentially, I think, a very nice kind of portrait. So we should not confuse Russia's willingness to pursue, in this case, strategic arms reductions and to sign a new treaty with the United States as a sign of a change in Russia's view of how the international system works, what is the balance of power, or any acceptance of the need to move beyond old-style measures of national power and national security. Right? New START Treaty was a matter, I would argue, of absolute necessity to Russia, rather than a change, the horse changing its spots in any way. Right? Said, absent the agreement, Russia would have had to reduce its forces unilaterally. Now, in an era where the two parties, or the three counting China, no longer see each other as adversaries, why should this be a problem if you're a little bit lower, a little bit higher? Because for the leaders of the Kremlin, it was imperative as a psychological and political, as well as strategic move, that they ensure that the U.S. would come down symmetrically, equally. Any other outcome would be a clear acknowledgement of Russia's weakness, and an enduring weakness, not simply a temporary case. Right? So in addition, I would argue to you that nuclear weapons have tended in the last decade to take on an expanded role in Russian security planning. That's even reflected in the national security strategy. When it goes back to the 2000 doctrine, it's quite clear that the role of nuclear weapons had actually increased. The circumstances under which nuclear weapons might be used had expanded from the traditional Soviet era. And as a result, in a sense, that adds to the logic for retention of not only a few nuclear weapons, but a fairly robust nuclear arsenal. In addition, it may make particularly difficult the next rounds of reductions, which are almost assuredly going to have to deal with the non-strategic nuclear weapons. Why is that? Because the Russian formulation of sort of the contingencies for war and the way it sees the main utility of its nuclear weapons is as a way of preventing or controlling, stopping a conventional war from starting or escalating. And they talk about the various scenarios for the use of that. So in a sense, the Russians really need that theater capability in order to be able to form the first, if you will, bright red line in a intra-war deterrence paradigm, then leading to some use of strategic nuclear forces, maybe even a mix, some scenarios call that, before there is actually a central exchange. Now, that above discussion about Russia is not intended by me to suggest there is no room for progress on some arms control issues, maybe a number of them. We've seen at least some agreement on Iran sanctions and the rest. But rather, I want to make 2 points with this. First is the idea that nuclear weapons can be rendered irrelevant or even eliminated entirely is in stark contravention of the Russian view of the role those weapons play in their security and, frankly, in domestic politics. Secondly, that the effort to assuage Moscow's sense of injury over the loss of Russia's position of eminence in the world since the end of the Cold War is both dangerous, since it feeds an exaggerated feeling of entitlement, and I would argue ultimately futile. So if that, in a sense, is part of what the administration means in the NPR and the rest about strategic stability, if you will, the psychodrama piece of it, we're in for a very tough time. All right, moving on to China. I mean, without question, the smallest arsenal, so small in some respects, one sort of wonders why all these years the Chinese have at least put forth the appearance of being confident in their ability to deter. Part of that, I suspect, may be because they really were on the sidelines of the main game. And so in some respects, they could sort of say, you know, yes, we're China, yes, we'll even get into confrontation with the United States, but truly we're the sideshow, and therefore we don't have to inflict or threaten to inflict much damage for it not to be worth the ante. Also at the time, for most of the Cold War, they were very careful about what they were doing to antagonize us overall. Right? The Chinese nuclear force is modernizing. There's been some discussions in intelligence documents that it's expanding. It's not clear, at least not to me, that the Chinese force is actually expanding. I mean, they're clearly modernized. We're clearly going from the more vulnerable silo-based liquid fuel systems at the strategic level to the solid fuel road mobile capabilities. We're now moving into having a submarine launched capability. How large isn't clear, although there's been some suggestions, 5 or 6 Jing-class SSBNs might at least be the first stage. So you're talking then about I mean, now the force is 20 to 40 overall with one submarine of 12. So you're talking maybe 50 strategic weapons max, and going to a force that may be double or at most triple that. Then there's some number of shorter range weapons on missiles and a few air delivered weapons. So, you know, the guess is nuclear weapons, or at least employable nuclear weapons, in the several hundred. The actual overall stockpile, unknown, a transparency issue we'll have to deal with. And it's been raised by the NPR, in fact, as being a block to moving forward in some of these nuclear reductions. Chinese nuclear strategy, I mean, has been relatively consistent, aside from the very early stage where they simply said, you know, nuclear weapons don't count and we could lose 500 million people, that was Mao's line, and still go merrily on our way. It continues to hold, at least as far as the 2008 Defense White Paper, to what it's had as a policy for a long time, which is no first use and a defensive use of nuclear weapons. I mean, in that is an acceptance of the reality of nuclear deterrence, although the political documents will talk about that's a bad thing and we have to end it. It's not our fault, it's the Americans or even the Russians' fault. The nuclear strategy, it was really nicely summed up in one kind of pithy phrase by a retired general in a recent Liberation Army Daily article. Let me quote: "The most basic feature of China's nuclear strategy, in a nutshell," I'm not sure what the Chinese words are for in a nutshell, I have to find that out, "is to be a deterrent but to present no threat," unquote. Just a great line. I think it really speaks to the way the Chinese have approached this. Another Chinese source characterizes the current strategy as one of credible minimum deterrence. Not just minimum deterrence, but credible minimum deterrence. So although still based in part on the uncertainty surrounding, you know, sort of the numbers and all the rest, what is that minimum deterrent? Is it 20? Is it 50? Is it 100? Is it 2? Not clear, particularly in terms of what you really have to have surviving if you worry about being struck first. Not clear. But we know that they're moving to the idea of at least ensuring that the force is survivable. That is, credibility is related not simply to the ability to drop one on, but under all circumstances to be able to put enough weapons down on an adversary, on, I guess, the United States, Russia, that in fact it would be unacceptable. Credibility means that it's actually more weapons than fewer you would like to have. How many? Not clear, because I don't think, at least so far, there's no evidence that the Chinese have really done the kind of calculations that, you know, we've all known and loved in the U.S. Soviet context, you know, damage level. They talk about McNamara criteria as just kind of an off-the-hand way of referring to it. You know, get to that kind of stage, and you know you have enough, and that's clearly could be achieved at numbers much lower than what the United States and the Soviet Union or even Russia have today. The central operational context for nuclear force is the ability to execute what they call a minimum retaliating strike. So few weapons. What's minimum? Not clear. Not clear if it is, to what extent it's based upon the feelings, attitudes, beliefs of the other, those being deterred, or to what extent there's sort of at least a notional level that reflects some sense of damage, some kind of, counting the number of scalps. Now, from what we can tell of the PLA's, the Second Artillery's, nuclear C3 and warhead storage and handling approaches, this seems to be supportive of these kind of notions. That is, you don't have the forces put in such a way and the command and control put in such a way where it's hair trigger, where they have to worry about getting the maximum number off, where they worry about launch out from under and all the rest. I mean, there's some reason to believe that clearly this is not just words, that minimum, credible or otherwise, means sort of what it says. Now, the 2009 annual assessment of the Chinese military capabilities does also talk about other missions potentially for China's nuclear forces, including deterring a conventional attack against China's nuclear assets or conventional attacks with WMD-like effects. That harkens back to an old Soviet era comment on sort of, fourth generation warfare, if I recall correctly. Second thing they talk about is in reinforcing China's great power status and increasing its freedom of action by limiting the extent to which others can coerce China with nuclear threats. So neither is necessarily inconsistent with keeping a small arsenal or being in a retaliatory mode. I would argue to you, though, that Chinese writings on nuclear deterrence and strategy are becoming more thoughtful and nuanced. Take that for what it's worth. Doesn't mean that they are on the march or that the arsenal is going to expand, but discussion of scenarios has expanded. In fact, there is even discussion of scenarios, which is something relatively new. With the idea, in some cases, not simply of inflicting counter-value damage, but to having an impact on the opposing forces and their leadership. Counter force, but really kind of almost objective denial, dissuading by telling the other side that they won't achieve the military objective. There's at least one source who discussed the idea of intra-war deterrence, something we sort of didn't think was in the cards with respect to the Chinese. And the quote here is, "The goal of wartime deterrence is to prevent conventional war from escalating into nuclear war and to prevent low-intensity nuclear war from further escalating," unquote. In some respects, not that different than what the Russians have been talking about. And this same source related the ability to have these controlled employment, controlled options, if you will, to the concept of an effective and credible minimum deterrence. So that also suggests that's at least among some thinkers, not official policy, we never know really where to draw the line between statements and that, that we've moved beyond or we're into a concern that the simple kind of equation of trading Shanghai for Los Angeles for Taipei may not be fully credible as a Chinese strategy or a threat to the West, and something else needs to be added to that process, maybe some rungs on the escalatory ladder. Now, in addition, there's also the question of, if you want to call it, asymmetric approaches. At least one US scholar suggested that the PLA, the Chinese, may employ active countermeasures such as anti-satellite operations during a crisis or conflict in order to protect its strategic deterrent by essentially taking out our ability to go track it and look at it. So there would not be a nuclear first use or not necessarily even a conventional strike against terrestrial targets or terrestrial resources that might threaten those forces, but against something that would simply make it difficult to go after their nuclear forces. Now, I would sort of think for a moment that the Chinese no first use minimum deterrence posture may well have been the product of a unique set of circumstances and a set of security requirements and issues that allowed it to take the low-cost, slow-to-modernize approach, sort of flying under the radar screen of the US-Soviet rivalry. I'm not sure, but I don't know, which way they'll go, that this is going to be possible for the Chinese to do in the years going forward. Its role has changed, its self-perceived place in the world has changed, its range of security interests has expanded, there's the possible development of a network of allies, Chinese allies, it certainly has economic interests now that are global in character. There's the evolution of the balance of conventional capabilities and the nuclear programs of China's neighbors. The buildup of anti-access area denial capabilities by the PLA and corresponding US countermeasures some of which, of course, involve strikes on the mainland, could lead to the desire for more nuclear options, and from that potentially the need for a larger, more secure, and more usable force, although that's not a guarantee. But we've sort of assumed that the game is sort of in one direction, US, Russia coming down. At some point it meets a modernized but still small Chinese force, and then the other French, British, whoever on the periphery. And that may be the case. On the other hand, one could think about some place where at least the Chinese come up as we come down, meet somewhere in the middle. That's the kind of more optimistic conclusion. All right, so that's sort of where all three stand. I mean, there really are some similarities, but also substantial differences in each nation's perception of the threat, perception of the others, view of the role of nuclear weapons, view of what's sufficient, view of how they get played out, all of which then has to be sort of racked and stacked and played with if we're going to get to even deeper reductions. So moving on to this question about the balance between nuclear and other forces, I think it's becoming highly important. We're clearly seeing an ongoing revolution in the means of conventional warfare. Secretary Gates has pointed out in a number of speeches the capabilities that underlie this revolution are proliferating. He's made repeated reference to this, to the so-called anti-access area denial threats being deployed not just by China, but Iran and even Hezbollah. Now, at the same time, the U.S. is quite clear, and the NPR sort of makes great reference to this, that the U.S. position is conventional means, including missile defenses, offer a way of maintaining deterrence and reassuring allies while relying less on nuclear weapons and possibly even dissuading some potential proliferators from pursuing a nuclear capability. So we have, if you will, the conventional force option coming up on our side as it also increases or becomes more potent in the hands of potential adversaries. So if we're looking forward in terms of the idea of reductions, we got sort of two issues of importance or two particular concerns. One is clearly Russian conventional weakness, and the other is growing Chinese military capability conventionally. I talked about Russian weakness, but just a few more points. They have begun a reform effort. We've talked about it, they've begun it, but it's clearly questionable how far they can go, given a lack of funds, personnel, et cetera. I mean, they're now in the position, having just recently sort of had to bite the bullet and take the very difficult decision, emotionally difficult, psychological, of looking to buy advanced conventional capability. We're talking about landing ships, Mistral, French-class landing craft, from overseas. That was a big step. And it's not, to the Russians, sort of a statement of, okay, we can get over this, it's okay to do this. It's really clearly, in their eyes, a continuing sign of their weakness. Right. Even if they can solve the problems demonstrated by the Georgian intervention, there were many, this may mean very little vis-a-vis the chief concern, which is the US and NATO. So the perception in some respects is on the conventional side still falling behind. In fact, and this relates to also the idea that they also see us as moving up on the conventional ladder. The final report of the Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States notes that, and I quote, ironically, our edge in conventional capabilities has induced the Russians, now feeling their conventional deficiencies, to increase their reliance on both tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. So as we come up, the Russian weakness is a real problem. China. China is focused on what it calls winning local wars under conditions of informationization, information environment. That's a horrible word. Secretary of Defense has talked about this. The DNI in his testimony has talked about all the various things the Chinese are doing, creating these anti-access area denial capabilities, on and on and on and on. I'm not sure that PLA modernization is either surprising or by itself an indicator of intent. Rather, obviously, the concern that it raises for us, and to some extent for the Russians, is the scope and pace and focus. But I think we also have to take it in context of what we are talking about in terms not only of our current capability, but also how we may respond. So proposed US modernization programs is outlined in the QDR as discussed in some very important think tank analyses, clearly oriented towards countering Chinese military modernization. The high-end threat, the name isn't often used, but it's rather hard not to see China, the map there of China behind the words. There's at least one recent cutting-edge analysis, which is retrieving a great deal of attention in this town, which emphasizes all kinds of strikes on the mainland, blowing corridors, destroying the Chinese integrated air defense, taking out their sensor systems, and on and on and on and on. You know, I would point out that during the Cold War, homeland attacks were always considered something of a bright line, whether they were conventional or nuclear. Let's remember back to the days of INF deployments and Russian concerns about the implications of conventional strikes, Pershing Glickam strikes on Russian targets for what was then the possibility of escalation. The Russian threat perception really does talk about the problem for that country of conventional forces on both sides, that is the Chinese and American, and by some extension in the hands of at least some of our allies and maybe even some third parties. The national security strategy sort of speaks about, and I quote, a number of leading foreign countries aiming at achieving overwhelming superiority in the military field, especially in the strategic nuclears, but through the development, strategic nuclear forces, but through the development of high precision information and other high-tech means of warfare, strategic weapons in a non-nuclear role, and the formulation of a unilateral global missile shield. The last one is sort of obviously directed at us. So as we're looking at the balance here, the interesting problem is what to us, and perhaps to the Chinese, might be a development that would allow, enable, reassure us that we could in fact reduce nuclear forces, or in the Chinese case, stay small, is in fact adding to the pressure that Russia must feel. On missile defense, the other sort of big topic. Clearly, the sides clearly disagree on the role of missile defenses. Missile defenses, particularly those in Europe, seem to strike at the very heart of the Russian strategic concept and Moscow's requirement to be able to hold NATO at risk, Europe at risk, regardless of the balance of forces between Russia and the United States. Russia was explicit in regarding, expressing its concerns about the creation of the so-called third site. However, you know, it's almost not quite as upset about such things as the recent deployment of a US Patriot battery in Poland simply for tests. I mean, in part, this reflects Moscow's abiding interest in being able to threaten the continent, but there's also a certain sort of reality to it. I would point out that the current administration's plans for a phased adaptive approach to missile defenses, and when you actually kind of push on what are you eventually able to do or planning on doing, I mean, you find that the eventual deployments call for sites, you know, like roses petals scattered all across Europe, enough to protect the entire continent from Iranian or other missiles. Well, is this a platform for the deployment of a real anti-Russian missile defense? Or put it the other way, all right, so Russia is willing to go down in numbers, but we've had this Iranian defense, and now whatever residual forces the Russians are willing to, or have to accept, are devalued to some degree by this capability. Clearly a problem. China sees missile defense as unnecessary and destabilizing to the extent that they may prompt a renewed arms race. Not clear the PRC would participate in such a race, but it's possible. I mean, in a sense, if you are looking at credible minimum retaliatory capability, deterrent capability, how many weapons actually have to get through for that to work? 1, 2, 3, you know, maybe number may still be small in the Chinese consideration, so it's not worth ramping up in response to even an NMD deployment, obviously up to some level, because while that might add to your deterrent, that might also present a threat, to harken back to the Liberation Daily article. NMD deployments so far have prompted criticism, but no apparent acceleration deployment of Chinese strategic forces. They've talked about countermeasures and such. All right, that's still relatively modest response. That said, defenses at some point, maybe more in the theater than strategically, may prompt China to increase its numbers of missiles and warheads, but not to change its posture or doctrine. And again, I've suggested to you that up to some point, that may be acceptable. And one of the things that we need to consider is, you know, is there a trade? Is there possible to make a trade between deploying defenses in order to deal with regional threats of concern to us and our allies, accepting that the Chinese may respond by some increase, but that the overall threat level doesn't rise, in fact, may overall decline sufficiently that the net assessment is it's in our favor. You know, there are some analysts, more on the Russian side than the Chinese side, who do kind of raise the question of the combination of missile defenses and advanced conventional strike, particularly prompt global strike, creating a capability for kind of a preemptive disarming operation. So you'll use the conventional forces, never touch nukes, be able to reduce the adversary's nuclear forces without kind of causing the kind of casualties that would, under any circumstance, elicit a nuclear response. And then when the other side looks at the kind of response, it might even be able to still initiate. Defense is able to soak up enough of that the numbers are so low that, in a sense, the deterrent is gone. That's been raised as an issue. I think it's rather more difficult to achieve that kind of end than the commentators suggest. Clearly relates to the quantity and quality of global strike and missile defense assets, but also the nature and size of the adversary's strategic forces, their posturing, alert status, warning systems, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I would suggest to you, so now mixing the kind of the conventional force increase point with the missile defense point, that at low numbers of nuclear forces, the potential for this kind of disarming scenario would seem to increase. Of course, leading one then, when you think about the arms control side of, future arms control side of stuff, is at what point do we have to think about truly comprehensive arms control and deal with all the advanced conventional stuff, the missile defense, non-nuclear missile defense, and nuclear forces, both strategic and non-strategic. And to do that not simply bilaterally, US and Russia, maybe not even trilaterally, but truly multilaterally. It's sort of a amazing Rubik's Cube problem. I would add one more issue, and I don't really have a lot to say, but I would just raise it, which is, what about cyber war? Is that in some respects the future of strategic warfare? How do we factor that in? I mean, frankly, is it ongoing today? We don't even know really how to talk about this. We don't even know necessarily who's doing what to whom, but the point is, does that become something, does it have to be factored in some way? How do you factor it in? Or, as in some of the historic arms control agreements, even those that reduced forces, are we simply replacing one form of warfare for another? Now, I suppose if it doesn't involve new debts, that may be a good thing, even if all our computers get fried. But a question worth raising, one of those kind of tough questions that we're nowhere near able to even discuss amongst ourselves here, much less, I think, take it out to an international audience and have anything sensible said about it. So, I mean, the balanced questions and where they're going are terribly important, I think, and central to the future of the sort of nuclear relationship between the three parties, and frankly, at this point, rather unsettled. It's not the kind of stable basis, when we had CFE, INF, and all the rest, we could then go on the strategic side, knowing that we had sort of done a fair amount, we and the Russians, or the Soviet Union then, to kind of manage the conventional competition. We're not in that place with respect to the future conventional competition, whether it's on offensive or the defensive side. And that's going to weigh on any effort to reduce nuclear forces in the future. So going on to the future of nuclear arms control, and a little bit on the zero option. I said in my introduction that I thought we might be on the threshold of this kind of new at least interesting era in nuclear literature, if not actually in changing the state of play and coming to a brand new set of relationships. But there are clearly things that stand in the way. First, can and must the U.S. and Russia go lower before the process can be multilateralized, and where is that point? Now, the global zero people talk about either 1,000 or 500 as the point when you multilateralize, and frankly, which is it? Or is it 200? I mean, these things matter, and I suggest we don't even have the analysis to know, as a political issue, much less as a kind of military technical question, as a question of exchanges and balances and surviving and all this, what numbers really matter. So, do we need another round? Do we go right to multilateralization with all of its own problems? Now, China has dismissed the idea of entering into discussions on reductions of its own forces until the US and Russia bring theirs down further. The suggestion, it's not stated explicitly how far they would have to go, is sort of come down to around our end of the pool, come into the shallow end before we're going to allow you to kind of bring us into the talks. Now, in addition, the Chinese writers have proposed a number of steps that need to be taken in order to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in Russian and U.S. national security policies. Most obviously, they want a no first use declaration, but also, for example, we should no longer list countries as targets, something we have done in the NPR. We should remove nuclear weapons deployed outside national borders. maybe, but that's still kind of TBD, and the practice of providing nuclear umbrellas to other countries, i.e. extended deterrence has to go as well. Now, it's not clear whether these are preconditions. This is not kind of official government statement, but could be, or simply kind of thoughts that the Chinese have about how one gets to a place where we can all comfortably enter into discussions of very low numbers or of even going to zero. But from a U.S. and I would say certainly a Russian point of view, this adds a lot of burden to the process of just getting the numbers down. And I'm not sure it's necessary. Maybe. Necessary in a technical sense or in kind of an operational sense. Maybe politically necessary. All right, so if we have to go lower, if the Russians say we have to go lower, what about Russian, U.S., and even Chinese non-strategic nuclear weapons? Now, I would suggest to you, based on my prior discussion, that Russia is not likely to easily relinquish one of the few areas of military advantage it now possesses, which is its non-strategic nuclear forces. Old as many of them, all of them may be. One old-time Cold Warrior, Andrei Kokoshin, has made the case, in fact, in a writing in 2009, for Russia's retention of a superiority in tactical nuclear weapons in light of the threats that it allegedly must confront. Let me quote, "Our national security strategy is different from that of the United States. Tactical nuclear weapons are advantageous for us and necessary for the provision of national security. What matters is not so much the number of nuclear warheads and their carriers to be stipulated in a would-be treaty." He was thinking ahead to the New START. "The most important thing is that the treaty must secure for Russia a guaranteed capability for inflicting unacceptable damage in a retaliatory strike against any and all countries that carry out a nuclear attack on it or participate in one." So it would not even be central deterrence. If NATO is part of the process of an attack, it also needs to be dealt with, and that's a non-strategic problem. U.S. might be willing to deeply or even completely eliminate its remaining non-strategic weapons. What about U.S. allies? I don't mean what about their weapons, how do they react to this? What do they do? Getting them on board may be a protracted process all on its own, but even if they were okay with the idea, and some already have expressed some interest in this, some governments at least, would we be? That is, one reason for having the weapons deployed overseas forward, the theater weapons, was to ensure that our allies had some skin in the escalatory game. Also to ensure in some respect that there was a seamlessness of the latter. It wasn't this jump start to everything blows up, but you had a logical relationship between deterring conventional or even limited aggression to deterring nuclear use, to deterring theater nuclear war, to deterring all-out nuclear war. Will Americans, Congress, the decision makers be willing to be the only ones at risk? Now, this is the proverbial war fought over Europe's head. Now, if we all get rid of when we all get rid of nuclear weapons, not a problem. In the meantime, the idea of essentially Europe or other allies being true free riders on this particular issue may be a non-starter politically in the United States, should not be left out. Chinese non-strategic nuclear weapons pose a threat to Russia, key U.S. allies, friends such as India, and even U.S. bases in the Asia-Pacific region. Unless all of Beijing's neighbors are non-nuclear, obviously Japan, but also India, would China have any interest in giving up its regional deterrent even for deeper reductions in U.S. and Russian strategic arsenals? So that given the size of the Chinese force, that rapidly gets to the point of saying you can't really make it a three-ball problem. Us, Russians, and the Chinese. Once you get to sort of involving the Chinese, you almost have to involve everybody else. And so it goes from two-party problem to a multi-party problem in what amounts to one fell swoop. Third issue, then, is missile defenses. Obama administration has confirmed the view of its predecessors that missile defenses are a legitimate, even central part of the deterrence and reassurance equation, if not for central conflict, certainly when it comes to theater war. Provide reassurance to allies in Persian Gulf, Northeast Asia, Europe, et cetera, that might otherwise be only attainable by explicit nuclear guarantees. I mean, there's a bit of a kind of a irony here, which is the missile defenses, which may cause you problems on the in central strategic relationships, are being put out there so that we can overall reduce the role of nuclear weapons in our security policy. But in so doing, you may increase the interest in nuclear weapons on the part of some of the people you're also concerned with. It's not even chicken or egg, I'm not sure quite how to describe it. It's a real dilemma for us. Clearly, neither the Russians or the Chinese have the same affinity for missile defenses that this administration or its predecessor had. There's the question, I think I mentioned before, of how nuclear weapons play at lower levels of strategic forces. Even before we begin to consider their implications for a multipolar arrangement. Now, there are different views. One view, kind of more common view, certainly the Russian and Chinese view, is they tend to be destabilizing, except in under very tight parameters, even encouraging arms racing. Others have argued that it's stabilizing. It may make it actually easier to go down to low numbers without fears of kind of instabilities, without the worry that as you move from triads to dyads or monads or whatever, that you'll create a first strike incentive or some other kind of decapitating potential vulnerability. And one could even conceive of a world in which defenses are introduced and then withdrawn, but that involves kind of a real I think sophisticated strategic analysis, strategic argument, which we're, again, not able to make. Russia and China clearly have two basic problems with the U.S. pursuing effective theater defenses. The first is the impact of those defenses on their efforts to deploy superior theater capabilities, including non-nuclear. Second is their belief that theater defenses, particularly if interconnected and connected to space-based and other mobile sensors, could be a dandy platform for the creation of a full-up, global, strategic, disarming defensive capability. Again, tougher to do in practice, we all know, but one can at least have some sense of why the concern might be there, how one assuages it, what's the levels of defenses that are, on the one hand, appropriate for the theater missions, but not sufficient to actually threaten the retaliatory capability of Russia or China, and how it changes as the number of offensive weapons change. TBD, we don't know. We haven't really done the analysis. Okay, and then the third issue is, do you want limitations on conventional, or fourth issue, conventional prompt global strike? I mean, are you even going to have that? But if you do, what does that mean? Do those kind of forces in and of themselves, in sufficient numbers, or if the target set is sufficiently small, constitute a destabilizing capability? Are we going to be faced with new kinds of Pearl Harbors with small, very precise weapons? I mean, there clearly may be a blurring of the line as we go forward between these destabilizing strategic conventional capabilities and those required for ensuring deterrence, reassuring allies, dissuading potential nuclear proliferators, thereby allowing those who go that route to reduce reliance on nuclear forces, a dilemma all its own. All right, so we have some problems and things to get through before we can even get to this notion of really dropping the numbers down. But let's assume we sort of get through all that. What then? All right. So the really interesting time come when these issues are resolved, and we can think about all these other really juicy problems. I mean, those who remember the great times during the Cold War of modeling exchanges between us and the Soviet Union, and all the issues that went into that, and the timing and signaling and on and on and on, know how much harder, just from that experience, the problem becomes when you increase the number of players by even one, going from two to three. And beyond that, we know, the data from sociological and psychological studies, how unstable three-party relationships are. Always the problem of two ganging up on one. I would also argue to you that in most instances, the history of multilateral arms control is not encouraging. That is, when you have a ban, chemical warfare treaty or even bio, all right, you can sort of say everybody allegedly gets rid. But when you're talking about these sort of, let's stabilize at controlled levels, the history isn't good. Look at the interwar naval treaties, which is often referred to or referenced as a kind of historical example of what the nuclear treaties might be like in general. They established quantitative and to some extent qualitative stability, at least at first. Of course, they were based on the idea that the weapons were the problem, not the politics, which turned out to be entirely wrong. One might even say, as a kind of cautionary to us all, that the effort at naval arms control may actually have helped to have precipitated World War II, in particular by radicalizing Japanese politics and creating the opportunity for a nationalist militarist clique to seize power. You have the treaties. I'm not sure if it was the Washington or London Treaty, and the Japanese immediately start a process of assassinating political leaders and all the rest, leading to what amounted to an internal coup. Now, cautionary note here. Clearly, the precondition for really low numbers, much less zero, is acceptance of minimum deterrence as a principle. This, in turn, requires that the participants in that process disentangle themselves from the political or strategic commitments and interests they have that require security guarantees. In this respect, the Chinese may be right. You do have to essentially eliminate the nuclear umbrellas in order to bring those numbers really down. And it's not simply a numbers question. I'm not talking about because the target sets are so large. I am talking about essentially what happens when one has to essentially think about an escalatory process in the nuclear deterrence, nuclear retaliatory business, which doesn't allow you to get low, plus, creates additional major problems in terms of move, counter move, either in the arms buildup or arms build down, or actually in the exchange of weapons. If the only problem were the United States, with a set of alliances, minimum deterrence might even be possible. But we, the Chinese, even the Russians, exist in a web of relationships that make it very difficult to completely disentangle ourselves, much less obviously go down to zero. But if you pursue that, this entanglement kind of leads naturally to the separation of U.S. force levels from those of Russia, France, and Great Britain. Now, in the past, Russia had sought compensation for those forces, you recall, in the strategic arms agreement. So this may be a way in which we can sort of get out from under having to somehow drag along, if you will, the Allies and their forces, because by all indications, they're very reluctant to get rid of them as well. Discussing it, yes. Get rid of them, hard to believe. But at low levels of targets of low levels, those linkages are going to be problematic, quite clearly. And the disentanglement process, not simple by any means, and could, as we talk about why we have nuclear security guarantees to Japan and other countries, may produce their own problems. Actually, we may go in the opposite direction of, by trying to disentangle in order to lower the numbers, in order to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons, or because we reduce reliance on nuclear weapons, we prompt the nuclear arms race. And so the cycle then goes the opposite way. Second problem, as we think about low numbers, is what I call the conveyor belt phenomenon. This is the one in which the nuclear relationship between country A and B impacts on how C sees B's posture, which causes C to create forces or changes force posture. That now is a concern to country D. That pulls the plug on the whole exercise. Right? Not possible. I mean, you start to think about Pakistan to India to China to us to then Russia on the next side. Not that hard to get into the 6 degrees of separation on nuclear force options. So even if we can do the proverbial 3-ball juggle, we better be prepared to be able to juggle a lot more than that. And I would argue, we don't even know how to begin to do that. Kind of last point in this whole question of where we go. We really have no idea what constitutes a stable balance at low numbers. No, neither in some sense do the Russians or the Chinese. Chinese know what's sort of okay for them. But if you sort of said, okay, what does it work out when everybody's playing this game? Nobody knows what that really means. Now, the theory of minimum deterrence would suggest that it doesn't matter, right? 1, 2, 3, some tiny number hitting counter value targets, and that's good enough. But I will argue that it probably will, certainly until such time as universal peace breaks out. It's particularly important as we have to think about, or should at least think about, issues of crisis and first strike stability, second strike adequacy, et cetera, et cetera. And particularly important as we're sort of in that intermediate ground between very, very, very low numbers, not quite zero, but approaching, and where we are now. In those intermediate steps, base camps, as some people like to talk about them. And how we then factor in all the other capabilities. We have no idea how to do it on the nuclear side. Now add in advanced conventional forces, prompt global strike capabilities, missile defenses. I suppose one could even ask questions about advanced air defenses, and on and on and on and on. What's the calculus? What's the model? What's the algorithm? That alone might take us 10 years, and we can put everything else on the back burner. So look, current proposals for 1,000 weapons is the next step with 500 vehicles or whatever the number is, and then maybe half that, and then proportional reductions, and then finally zero. It all sounds nice, almost too much so. What's the analysis behind any of that? I would argue there isn't any. I mean, it's a spot on the wall. And personally and professionally, I suppose, I'd be really reluctant to even move in that direction without a hell of a lot of analysis. The due diligence really needs to be done, and done in spades, and checked, and cross-checked, and recross-checked. And then, of course, lastly, and we haven't even talked about that up till now, but this New START treaty kind of raises that issue again, verification of zero, or even verification of near zero. The arguments by those who sort of want to go to zero is in part, look at all the problems we have with nuclear control systems and, everybody very with hair trigger and scared launch and all the rest. Well, if these systems that we have spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort, can be spoofed, can be surprised, what happens when you're trying to put together for the first time a global, complete, true, without exception, no sparrow shall fall verification system for a zero world? I would suggest that whatever complaints people have had about nuclear command and control for us, the Russians, anybody else, pale into comparison to what would be required to have real confidence in the verification capabilities for the zero world. So laying that out alone would be a problem. Now, let me give you just a couple points of conclusion, if I can, which is, from the U.S. point of view, let me just talk about that for a moment. I'm concerned that the support for the eventual goal of total denuclearization makes it difficult to argue the case for modernizing the force in the interim. Yeah, there's been money put to some of it. We have discussion about new versus modern versus safe versus secure, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm concerned about is that the danger the United States will be able to get neither out of this, a modernized strategic posture, nor zero, and will be trapped, in a sense, in a variant on what Russia is experiencing now. Worst outcome in some respects because the United States will be forced to continue to rely, at least to some degree, on nuclear deterrence for its security, with a strategic posture increasingly obsolete, of uncertain performance, and able only to wreak massive damage rather than to be as selective and precise as we would like. Still, maybe provocative here for a minute, that may be a preferred strategy. The better one would be a modernized nuclear arsenal if at some lower numbers, but that may still be a preferred strategy. Nuclear reliance with an old force, the Russian option, as compared to a failed attempt at global denuclearization. All right? Not only is there the question of the unprecedented level of monitoring that would be required, and the question of what is failure, what does a strategic surprise in the context mean, but unless you've also taken down the conventional forces, you may simply be replacing one kind of war threat with another, and conventional deterrence we do know fails. We don't have that experience yet on the nuclear side, although we can't be absolutely precisely sure of how nuclear weapons have played. I think it's hard to deny that nuclear weapons haven't had a deterring, stabilizing, and reassuring effect. So it may be that the uncertainties, the unknown unknowns of a failing denuclearized world may be worse than the other options. So it's not clear, to me at least, that despite arguments about the dangers of a proliferated world for U.S. security, bad third parties, terrorists getting their hands on nuclear weapons, it's not clear those dangers outweigh the risks created by a denuclearization path that is only partially traversed, particularly if it isn't done properly. That is, with attention to the forces, nuclear, conventional, and defensive. Let me even go one step further in closing, which is to say, I would assert that the potential threat of a single nuclear weapon in the hands of a non-state actor is less of a concern, or should be less of a concern to U.S. security, than would be a brittle and potentially failure-prone strategic balance among the great powers. And let me end there.
Good evening, sir. Sam McNeil from the National Defense University. I'd like you to expound a little, or get your thoughts on the current state of the credibility of the U.S. nuclear deterrence in light of We haven't tested since '92, and at some point the test pedigree becomes irrelevant, to paraphrase from one of the earlier NSSA directors. And also our lack of political will to fund the weapons complex makes it so that eventually the weapons complex simply can't support the strategy, and in the meantime sends a political message that we are not committed to this, therefore we may not be willing to use them under any circumstance. What's your thought on the effect of credibility there?
Let me add even one more point to that, which is those kind of problems, the question of lack of funding or the erosion of the talent pool, because what are they going to do? Nobody's seen an above ground test. We've almost lost everybody who's ever seen a test, much less built a weapon and all the rest. It puts a kind of premium in the minds of some people on a rapid move to zero. Because in a sense, the clock is ticking to the point at which, it's 20, maybe 20 years or 30 years, at which you won't have the capability to renew the force unless you're working it, and the existing force sort of ages out. So, I mean, I can see in some quarters why, in a sense, not doing it is one of those things that propels you to zero. It's sort of, even the opponents of zero may have to get on the bandwagon for that. Clearly, we need to make a distinction between building forces or building up forces, increasing the size, and keeping a modernized force. And I would argue that all the strategies we've had, including the current one for nuclear forces, really require that. Are we doing enough to do that? No. I mean, frankly, I would be in favor of work on new nuclear designs, even if you're actually not going to build them, or at least I would build and test, even if I wouldn't deploy. And frankly, I would even think of deploying. I mean, the idea of having megaton-class weapons, or half a megaton-class weapons, in this day and age seems to me to be an outrage, even if we're keeping nuclear deterrence. At the strategic level, central strategic, or if we're doing it in terms of a rogue party. I mean, you really want to put a half a megaton or whatever, 100 KT even, on Pyongyang just because, or pick I mean, even Yongbyon is going to have. So I would have argued that there's actually a moral imperative, my own view, to change out that force for something that makes much more sense in the context of the world we're in, even while maintaining that force. And adding to the credibility. I'm not one who actually believes beyond a very kind of gross level that we are required to demonstrate our bona fides on NPT and on everything else and purer than Caesar's wife in order to get everybody to go along and play. I mean, we're willing to play with other people who are still modernizing and still designing and all the rest. So why is it any different? There are other issues involved that transcend. If we don't modernize, if we don't have the trained cadre, and you arrive at a point where further progress, further reductions is not possible, you're in deep trouble. Absolutely. And eventually, I mean, your credibility certainly may be at risk. I mean, you always hope that the other side doesn't, have a way of calculating what the real probability that these things won't light off, or most of them won't light off, enough of them won't light off that they can simply kind of ignore us. But since we don't know, they don't know, I'm not sure who wins that kind of mental game at all.
Yes, I'm John Peterson from the NSSO, and I want to hear your thoughts in the triad for production facilities, not alone the proliferation of those technologies influencing the triad.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that for me? Which technology are we talking about?
I'm interested on your thoughts on the production facilities in the triad, as well as the proliferation of the technologies and capabilities outside of the triad and the influence.
One of the, see if this answers your question. In part, one of the things about nuclear weapons, in some respects, not maybe the preparation of materials and the rest, but with the weapons, is it's less rocket science than a lot of the other things that people are getting their hands on. And to a certain extent, having those capabilities makes up for a certain lack in other areas, either by numbers or even by capability. And I include sort of, that means something that may be important to the United States. It certainly seems to be important to Russia. Chinese, not clear where they stand on some of these questions of facilities and capabilities. Yeah, I'm not sure I have, that's about as far as my thinking really goes on that topics.
Tom Barnett with IDA. Could you talk a little bit about the Iranian threat, the North Korean threat, and the U.S. ballistic missile defense program and the Soviet? Seems obvious. They think that's a stalking horse for ballistic missile defense against their ICBMs and SLBMs. Where do you see that coming out? And we often make appeals to the Soviet self-interest to ballistic missile defense and to limiting Iranian capabilities, but that seems to be...
First thing I would point out is that Russia, and even to a large extent China, seem to be rather kind of sanguine about having these nuclear threats on their border. They certainly aren't engaged weren't and aren't engaged in stopping them the way that we would like to see them engaged, which sort of suggests, back to my point about, who's the adversary here, and then what does that mean for nuclear forces and disarmament, that for the Russians certainly, and even for the Chinese, the problem is not these rogue states, right? It's us, NATO, us, our allies, and the like. And in that context, of course, you have an interesting divide, chasm even, between the sides, because we see the deployment of certainly that phased, adaptive, theater-oriented defense, even this administration does, as being absolutely vital to dealing with those kind of rogue threats, and not something, for all the obvious reasons, character of the weapons, trajectories, et cetera, as having anything to do with the strategic deterrence of either Russia or China, and not really even given the numbers for their non-strategic forces. They see it differently, and I think partly because they see deploying those kind of capabilities as, for example, into Eastern Europe, as a visible, credible, continuing, valuable sign of U.S. commitment to those countries, to the alliance, a kind of physical connection, right? A communications connection, an intelligence sharing connection, and all the rest, which they would rather not see. That's where you get the protest, even the Patriot battery going in. I mean, give me a break here. In addition, the systems we're talking about deploying in sufficient numbers, in the right locations, with the right queuing, can be effective up to a point, right? And then you start to have problems as you get to have longer range missiles you're trying to deal with, and higher accelerations, plus, separation and maybe even eventually countermeasures, although that may be a way down the road, at which point let's assume we even got to that stage. The Russians were acquiescing to this, the Chinese sort of just held their tongues. But at some point, if these threats continue to advance, you'd have to go to, adaptive theater defense plus, and then things become sticky again. So, I mean, one isn't out of the woods just because you've said, for the moment, standard missile THAAD, get rid of NMD and GBI, or third sight and GBI, and all is fine with the world. How effective those systems are going to be against the new threats or the longer range threats, I don't know. And clearly, even on standard missile, I mean, we're making progress in that, and we've done very well in terms of hitting things, but you'd really like to have the 2B, the more advanced system, sure that it was going to make it. Right, that we were going to have that advanced one before I put all my eggs in the basket of the program the current administration is going with. So I mean, my own view was the third sight made a lot of sense because the technology risk was still too high for the period we're talking about. And things go wrong, governments change, so it was a risk we should not have taken, from my view.
If you then would please join with me in applauding tonight's presenter for a very, very well done presentation.
Appreciate it.